I want to pick up where the story leaves off here. King David was a powerful king. And all of those peoples that were around the small nation of Israel. Now, I want you to understand, for the adults in the room, I want to give you some things that maybe you didn't get when you heard this story in these stories in Sunday school on the child level, but I'll try not to spend too much time on it. Israel is not a big empire where it is located. It never covers the size of Genghis Khan's empire or the continental United States or anything like that. But the nation of Israel was placed in a strategic region. Because between Asia and Africa, there is, of course, the Sinai Peninsula, which is mostly desert. And so, when the great empires of Egypt and the great Hittite empires and the great, and later on the Persian empires and the Babylonians, they have a little strip of crossable land between them and Egypt. And that is the green part of the earth, not the desert part, that runs along the seashore, along the Mediterranean, from Egypt on up into those Asian empires. And what country is placed right there on the sea where armies march and controls all the trade routes? And they're not even a seafaring people. You get over to the coast and there's the Philistines and they're seafaring people and there's Phoenicians and there's other pagans. But if you wanted to trade over land, you had to go through Israel. And Israel was beaten and bloodied by a number of surrounding neighbors, but along came David, the man who killed a giant when he was still too young to be in Saul's army. And so you know this guy's got a lot of promise, right? And God says, this is the man after my own heart. This is the guy who, as a child, grabs a hold of the fur of a bear's face and hits him until he lets go of that lamb. This is who God is. This is what God is like. He protects His people. And David becomes king. And David takes his armies out into the surrounding areas and he subdues all of those nations. The Ammonites, the Philistines finally start to leave them alone. And he subdues all of these enemies and he turns to God. He turns to Nathan the prophet and says, I want to build God a house. Why should I live in a palace of fine timbers and luxury, and God still dwells in the tent that we made for Him in the wilderness? And Nathan said, David, the Lord is with you. Do all that is in your heart. And Nathan went home. Good job, preacher. You told the king what he wanted to hear. But Nathan receives a word from the Lord that night. And he visits David the next day and he says, I'm sorry I went ahead and blessed what you wanted to do because the Lord has interrupted me and told me that is not what God wants to do. David, you have shed too much blood. You cannot build a house to my name. But your son Solomon, who will be king after you. And I want to remind you, last week we talked about David and Bathsheba. And David, while on the roof of his house lounging about, because that is the custom in that part of the world to lounge on the roof of the house, gazed out. He was supposed to be off to war, and he saw a woman bathing, and she was so beautiful that he sent the secret service to tell her, you're being summoned to the palace, and he slept with her and sent her home, thinking that would be the end of it, when in fact they had a child together. And so, using the enemy army, he gave orders that her husband be sent to the hottest part of the battle, and then everyone else retreat, and he would be killed by the enemy. The enemy was only the murder weapon. David was the murderer, and he would have gotten away with it except that God was watching. God was watching and sent Nathan the prophet to tell him, God saw what you did, and you have to repay fourfold, which is, according to the Old Testament law, from Moses. By the way, keep in mind, Moses lived hundreds of years before David. Moses was just as much ancient history to David as he is to us. But this had come down from the time when they came out of Egypt. If you steal a man's sheep, you must repay fourfold. The child that he and Bathsheba conceived together died not long after childbirth. In fact, the poor thing was sick, and everyone could tell it was sick. And we often laugh at what medical knowledge they had back then, but it was plain to see this child was on its deathbed. And David took off his royal robes. He dressed in sackcloth and poured ashes on himself and was in visible mourning before everyone, begging God, take my life instead. I'm the one that committed the sin. In fact, his servants were scared to tell him that the baby had died, thinking, well, if he was like that, if he was that distraught while the baby was sick, what will he do when the baby has died? But when they finally told him, David cleaned himself up, got dressed, had something to eat, and explained that he had faith, that that child was never going to return to him, but that he would go to it. That he would go to see that child in the next life. And that's one of our great verses we hang on to when a child dies, that we will go and we will see that child in the next life within heaven. Time went on. David has a son. David has a son. David had 300 wives, okay? And concubines besides. David had sons and daughters and sons and daughters, and they all lived in some vicinity of the palace somewhere. It's like a small city, right? And you're only technically related. You don't feel related. You're not raised in the same household. This is ridiculous. And Amnon, one of David's sons, decided that he burned with passion for one of his half-sisters. There is another son named Absalom. He becomes important later. And this is his full sister, Tamar. I want you to know something about romance in the Bible. This feeling that you have inside that if you're not with this person, you will explode, has many times throughout history been treated as a madness. Did you know this? Now, in our day and time, we are told over and over again that you have got to listen to your heart, you have got to follow your heart, you have just got whatever it feels. You're not going to be fulfilled. You're not going to have a fully fulfilled life. You're not going to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy, and unless you go and find these things that you really want to do, you can be happy. And we get told this about our jobs. And there's some very good advice. Don't follow your passion. Some of you have found your dream job and found out it's still a job. And you still got to get up and go to work with it every day. Even when it's no longer fun, you've still got to get up and you've still got to go do it. And the same is true with romance. This is the biblical story of what happens in every marriage, okay? Because from the Bible, we know that this is how every marriage goes, right? One person born with a fallen nature, who is naturally sinful and selfish, is now attached financially, emotionally, physically to another sinful, born into sin, fallen nature human being. And two wrongs do not make a right. And so both of these sinful, fallen, selfish human beings have conflict in the marriage. It doesn't matter how much your heart fluttered when you first saw this person. I've had plenty of Christian old folks go, and you know, the day I saw her, I told her I was going to marry her. She didn't believe me, but I did, by golly. Yeah, thanks for that story, pal. Sending the rest of us on a wild goose chase, looking for that one person. No. Instead of falling in love, the Christian learns to decide to love. And not only do we decide to love our spouses, we decide to love our neighbors, and we decide to love our enemies. And so Amnon, if I don't hurry up, this is just going to be the story of Amnon and Tamar, and not about Solomon. Amnon burned with passion for this girl. One of his friends gave him some advice. Pretend to be sick and tell your father, King David, that the only thing that will help is if your wonderful sister Tamar comes and takes care of you. And so this was an odd request, but David's like, I got a bunch of kids. I don't have time to deal with you. Yeah, go take care of him. And she goes into the room, and he tells her, no, you got to make the cakes in front of me, and then you got to feed them to me yourself. This had to be creepy to begin with, all right? My impression of rereading this story to get it right, this had to be creepy to begin with. And then as she came close to feed him, he grabbed her and he had his way with her, and she was telling him the entire time, you cannot do this. If you would just ask our Father for us to do this the right way, we could at least do it the right way, which is still weird. You can't marry your sister under Mosaic law. But anyways, she was pleading with him to stop. And not only that, but once he had her, do you know what the Bible says? He hated her. What happened to all the passion? What happened to the need? What happened to, if I don't have Tamar, I will die? Now he hated her. And that's sometimes how that passion goes. All you have is a strong emotion. It can be diverted one way or the other. Absolute obsession or absolute hatred. It's too bad. It's too bad. The sooner we learn that on the dating scene and all that kind of stuff, we can start to make a little bit smarter decisions. Marry somebody with the virtues that God treasures at heart. Marry somebody that is on the same page with you in a lot of areas. And you won't be on the same page in everything. No couple is. You got to, and you got to marry somebody that's willing to work with you on a lot of that stuff. And as much as they annoy you, you got to find somebody that's willing to forgive you and your faults and your weirdness. Right? She does. I had taken that guitar that I used downstairs with the youth somewhere else to use it, and I brought it back. I couldn't find my Bible on the way this morning. You saw me running up there and running back and forth, if you noticed. She came back to help me find it because she knows I misplace stuff all the time. I married a good one. Willing to deal with... No, that's your pregnancy. She says I'm rubbing off on her. Now she forgets things all the time. That's the pregnancy. We have established that's the pregnancy. And also the fact that her brain's working overtime because it's helping take care of me. Absalom did not like his sister being raped. And he waited a long time. To Amnon's face, he acted like everything was fine. I think for about 2 years. And then finally found a way to take his... he invited all the king's sons to a party and killed Amnon. In fact, messengers came back to Jerusalem telling David, Absalom killed all of your sons. And then a second messenger showed up. No, that's not how it happened. He just killed Amnon because he raped Tamar a couple years ago, remember? Absalom stages a rebellion. Absalom decides, my dad is old. David is bedridden by this point. Absalom stages a rebellion. Absalom has the favor of all of the leaders of the various tribes of Israel, and he has gotten so much support that David and the entire household and much of his army flees Jerusalem, crosses the Jordan River, and hides out in the wilderness. But David has the big, strong warriors on his side, the men of war who have pledged their lives to David, who are going to follow David everywhere. So they've got a big army from the rest of Israel. They've got a big army out in the wilderness. And David remembers who takes care of them in the wilderness and who betrays them. But finally, Joab, the commander of David's army, takes the forces back across the Jordan River. And they finally meet the rest of Israel in open battle, and they corner Absalom. Now, as you can imagine, David had given strict instructions. Please, bring Absalom to me alive. He is still my son. And Joab told one of the young men, we've got him cornered. He was riding his horse and got caught in the branches of an oak tree and was hanging by his skull in the oak tree or something like that, or his cape or clothes or something, and his horse ran off without him, just like a Western. Just like, you can't make this stuff up, right? And Joab and the other soldiers found him, and Joab says, kill him. And the young man that he gave that order to said, but sir, the king said, don't kill him. And Joab said, He didn't say this, but it's like, I've been cleaning up King David's messes for years, is basically what I think he was thinking. And he got some higher-ranking officers, and they all took part in killing Absalom. And word came back to David. David got his throne back, but there's a daughter raped. There's the baby that was died shortly after birth. There's Amnon, and now there's Absalom. And the Lord did take He exacted his, I don't want to say revenge, but he exacted his price out of David's family. David had taken Bathsheba and killed Uriah the Hittite, her husband, and David had paid fourfold. Now, that means, since David and Bathsheba were together, that their union is cursed forever, right? No. No. Absolutely not. You know, God takes our broken, messed up, sinful lives, and He makes something out of it. You know, Jesus later on will say that if a man divorces his wife and he causes her to commit adultery, and some people have taken that very literally to say that divorce is just absolutely wrong in all circumstances, and even if it's okay, you can't get remarried. In God's eyes, you're married to that person. That's a whole nother discussion that we will have when we get to Jesus, and I tell you what, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong if you hate divorce, okay? Let's not be the pro-divorce church, but let's also be the people that understand that God did take the life of the newborn baby that they conceived in sin. Not that all babies that are conceived in sin deserve to have their lives taken or anything like that. We're not saying that at all, but that was part of David's price that he paid for completely blowing his position that God had given him. But God did not stay angry at the union of David and Bathsheba, because their second child was Solomon, King Solomon.